we were going to have more testimony on this subject. I think the witnesses couldn't make it, so we will reschedule that. So we had the agency in last week to brief us on the report that they do every year on the subject of composting of food residuals. And one of the things that came up there was the rulemaking process. And the statute says that the agency shall report every year on the status of that, and nothing's really happened since that law went into effect back in 2021. So it may or may not be consequential that nothing's happened, but since it's been 5 years, it seemed like let's find out from stakeholders or possible stakeholders what the impact may or may not have been. So asked Rural Vermont to come in, and thank you, Caroline, for joining us. This is Act 41, I think, of 2021. Right. Representative O'Brien.
So just for context, so nothing in legislation, it's just in rules, and we want to catch up with what's happening.
The legislation says
on the farm ground.
The legislation says there should be a rule. The agency shall go through the rulemaking process. And so that hasn't happened yet.
Okay.
And it says
but we couldn't really weigh in on that unless we decided, wait, we don't like the rulemaking.
Well, the rulemaking, if to the extent that it had happened, we could say something about it. We could always say something about it. And we could say something about it now, I suppose, after we've heard testimony, if we think that there's reason to do so.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. For the record, Caroline Sherman Gordon, Legislative Director of Rural Vermont. I really appreciate you guys showing interest in this subject. I think we've mentioned during our introduction that we really regret that this Act 41 from 2021 about composting food scraps on farms has not been implemented yet to its full extent, since we're still lacking a Act-specific rule. And so thank you so much for inviting me to speak a little bit more about that with you today. Really appreciate you showing interest and attention to that, because, as you said, it's been 5 years. And for the sake of this testimony, I thought maybe it would be helpful to just provide some more context about Rural Vermont's history in this advocacy effort, talk a little bit about Act 41 and also about Act 170, which is important in this context as well, and sort of a little bit about the rundown, what happened since, where are we now, what is sort of the outlook, if that's okay. So Rural Vermont has, over the 40 years of our existence, worked a bunch about composting in different forms as an issue. Soil health has always been an important cornerstone of our work. And as you know, we are a member-led organization, so we work a whole lot based on stakeholder groups that share a common interest and then shape the advocacy that we're organizing for. So Act 41 really came out of a stakeholder group that we called the Poultry Farmers for Compost Foraging. It was a group of 5+ composters of food residuals. Vermont Compost was part of that. Black Dirt Farm was part of that. Cloud Path Farm, Dog River Farm, Black Dirt Farm, a couple others who were unhappy that them composting food residuals would be designated as solid waste management, having specifically go through Act 250 permitting if they build infrastructure for that stuff, which is sometimes cost prohibitive because of the engineering cost, as well as flagging that this is a practice that was sort of incentivized with the Universal Recycling Law that passed a couple years before, Act 148, where there's established an organics management hierarchy in law that basically prescribes in law food residuals should be managed in accordance to this hierarchy, and farming is very much up high in the management hierarchy as sort of the first destination where food residuals should land if they can be reused, so donated, or if they actually have to become a food waste, then they should first see if they could go on farms, because part of that was that there's higher use if you can use it as an animal feed and not just composting itself comes then one step lower in the hierarchy. And so these farmers were doing just that. They raised poultry on the food scraps. That's what's called compost foraging. It's basically the poultry foraging the compost. And they say, well, that's really a really important innovative practice for raising poultry, because when you raise poultry, the highest input cost of doing that is the feed cost. So supplementing the feed cost with the food scraps makes the economics of raising poultry, but in the end, creating year-round cheap protein for the local population, better economics of that. And of course, what also good to know about this practice is that while farming is economically one of the least, profitable businesses or industries, waste management is one of the top 3 most earning industries nationwide. So combining the two, creating really valuable soil amendments, what it's now called in law, the compost, as well as having these lower input cost way of raising poultry makes possibly for a more viable farming business model as well. So we come together and advocating for Act 41. And basically what we succeeded with there, and I could go through the bill, but I'm realizing maybe it's not really possible or necessary at this time. What it basically did is 2 things, is change Act 250, the definition of farming in there, to add the composting of food residuals, as well as insert that same definition in the RAP rule. And maybe I will share my screen just for a minute, just so we can look at that language, because it reveals a little bit of the legislative intent. So while compost foraging is not mentioned in the statute itself in law, it is mentioned here in sort of the description of that section, and how the definition then shakes out. You will see. Let's get that I will zoom in a little more, maybe, that it becomes relevant there. So this is the Act 250 definition, but the RAP definition, required agricultural practices rule definition, mirrors this exactly, that basically the importation of up to 2,000 cubic yards per year or less of food residuals or food processing residuals onto a farm for the production of compost is included here, provided that either the compost is principally used on the farm where it's produced, or the compost is produced on a small farm that raises or manages poultry. And so why was that done? Basically, the legislative intent here was, we don't want a farm to be a farm if they're just a composting business. That should still be regulated as solid waste management. So those farms who add a component of composting food scraps, they would be basically held to land apply the majority of the compost they're producing on their farm. They can still sell a bunch of that compost, but the majority of it they would have to land apply on the farm where it is produced. And so the law is privileging those compost foraging practitioners, because they say, you're already a farm, you're already raising at least poultry, and so you should be able to make it also a business to like sell all the compost.
Representative Boston.
I guess I'm wondering why pigs aren't included in that. I used to work at a school that had a working farm, and we used to feed our food scraps to the pigs.
Right. I think there's other animal health concerns and diseases that could become a factor, so that pigs were never an equation in the making of this law. I forget the exact concern reference, but that is sort of why.
Okay,
Yeah.
just like in terms of volume, pigs could eat a lot more scraps than chickens if somebody was trying to get rid of their pumpkin rinds or their apple cores or whatever.
There's also an interesting aspect of having the chickens really forage on the compost itself, not just get the compost fed, but like live on the compost, because they're injecting their own manure into the compost mix.
Yeah.
And interesting enough, you can sell pelletized chicken manure as a fertilizer itself for gardening businesses. And so these composts that incorporate the poultry manure also make just a much more higher value compost. So that's part of the mix here too. So this law passed, it does a couple other things in terms of what was mentioned, that it establishes a rulemaking process. It charges the Agency of Agriculture to do that rulemaking process, and also to keep applying the ANR solid waste rules for small generators or managers of smaller facilities in the interim. So right now, that's still the law right now. We don't have the ag-specific rule. So the Agency of Agriculture is actually using the ANR rules for those composters. Agency of Agriculture has to report, that was mentioned. This law created the Ag Residuals Management Division in the Agency of Agriculture that didn't exist before. So there's other ag residuals that are being regulated by that division. So that's that. And then what I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. And what we realized as a coalition, once this law was passed also, was that, as you know, in farming, there's this issue of farm consolidation. Well, in waste management, there's also consolidation happening. We have Casella Waste Stream having the majority of the market share for management of food residuals in the state. And what we realized as a coalition, well, what they're offering is like a zero sort management of food residuals, which is actually contrary to the universal recycling law, where it's the statewide mandate, and that law took full effect at that time, that basically every resident in Vermont has to separate from its trash and recycling food scraps. So it's illegal now to like put your food residuals in with the trash. That's called source separation, that you put those food residuals separate. I might just need to drink a sip of water, sorry. And
Take your time, you can pause and have a drink, yeah.
yes, thank you. And
I know Caroline, you remember chatting with you last week, or maybe even the previous week, and you were battling the same cold that I think some of us have had. So if it turns out like you need to pause, we can continue the testimony later too.
thank you. That was helpful. And so what they use, what Casella Waste Stream offers with zero sort of food residuals, is they have it's called depackaging facility, where they can import packaged food residuals and mechanically separate the residuals from the trash. And so we started building a larger coalition called the Protect Our Soils Coalition to challenge that and question that, if that would to result in greater contamination risks of the slurry that comes out of that facility, because those slurries are being imported in digesters on farms and then like fermented there, and then land applied afterwards, also as a soil amendment. But of course, when you mechanically crush and grind packaging, including the food residuals, we envision that results to micro and nanoplastics, teeny tiny pieces of plastics, and PFAS resulting in the compost. Whereas on the farm, the farmer is told to only accept source separated materials free of packaging. And many farms have like industry standard or create industry standard of how to pick through the loads remaining plastics and reject contaminated loads, and to track that and work with the haulers to challenge those contaminated loads. So we worked also successfully as a broader coalition, including Vermont Public Interest Research Group and Conservation Law Foundation, a couple others, Compost Association of Vermont that you're going to hear from, on passing Act 170 that would basically charge ANR to also do rulemaking on what will be the requirements for those depackaging facilities. And so that kind of leads us to where we are now. Because the good news is ANR is going to release a draft rule for this now, finally. where they're actually gonna suggest to prohibit depackaging facilities to handle any source-separated materials, so that their market for managing food residuals will be reduced to those package residuals that are most often not post-consumer wastes, but like, let's say in the grocery store, when you had like deli items that were packaged that couldn't sell in large quantities, that those can go there, or other like lots of food scraps that otherwise would be very difficult to staff to manually unpack those through that facility. So that's a big coalition advocacy success. And they're also going to put into that rule some management standards that really reflect some of what our farming practitioners actually, how they handled, like in their voluntary effort to do this well, how they handled contaminated loads and management with haulers and stuff. And so that's positive for us to notice. Ben Gauthier from A&R just presented on this at the Vermont Organic Recycling Summit. So we're basically just waiting for the rule to be released, public comment period to open, and all that. But with the Agency of Agriculture in relationship to them, of course, myself for Rural Vermont and also Natasha Duarte from the Compost Association of Vermont, we've been sort of inquiring on a yearly basis, when are we going to see this rulemaking? Because you ask about what is the impact of not having a rule. And our biggest concern is, and Natasha will be better able to speak about that because they are consulting with farmers who want to get into that. And there's a couple others who do this kind of consulting with farmers who want to get into this practice. James McSweeney comes to mind as well. That if you don't know what is going to be the rule that regulates your practice and you're facing high investment costs, you might hold off doing this. And I'm honestly in my private capacity in the same shoes. I'm starting a chicken hatchery, and my vision is that I could have a community composting system go with that business and raise my meat birds in a compost foraging system. But I know that me building a 4-year-round timber frame infrastructure is like an investment of $200,000. And I don't know even what the setback requirements will be and other requirements for the management and setup of that facility, that I'm like kind of waiting for what's going to rise to the surface on this. So we're very concerned that the agency will be like not interested in offering this rule, because they, of course, can say like, there's only so few people doing this. But it's a little bit the chicken or the egg question, what has to happen first. And I think from a business development perspective, you would want to know what you're investing into, how you have to set it up to do it well, before you realize everything all at once. Of course, there's like low input ways of doing this, but and some do. And I was just also speaking at the Organics Recycling Summit. We had a panel on this, and it's just exciting. There, nationwide, people claim Vermont is a leader in the composting industries and a role model for how to innovate in the industry. And people are looking certainly to Vermont for rolling this out and continued showing that leadership and offering that opportunity for business development. And so it's the worst thing that could happen is that the agency would make a move to repeal the law or something, and to kind of block off that work that's ahead of them to get this program fully established and rolled up with rule. And I feel like we've been doing everything we could to inspire that. Like basically just when Act 41 passed, our existing coalition has produced a draft rule and submitted that. Nothing happened. Then the year later, we worked with Farm to Plate. There's different working groups within the Farm to Plate network, and I'm part of the Food Cycle Coalition, which is a community of interest. So Natasha and I worked with that group to work on the rule we already had drafted more and see what other, like seek broader input from the public and professionals in the industry to that draft rule. And we did that and submitted that. And so year after year, we heard from the agency there's other rulemaking concerns that stagnate them opening up the RAP rule. specifically around wetlands. And so we had great empathy and patience for them wanting to integrate this within the required agricultural practices rule. We thought that would be a great idea. Our latest rule draft would just do that, would not be a standalone rule. But we've kind of been, put on pause year after year that this would come at some point. And now we have a meeting scheduled for next Wednesday afternoon, April 15th, with a whole bunch of agency staff and hopefully see if they can fulfill this promise that rulemaking would happen this year. I'm on the Organics Recycling Summit at that panel. I got a little bit of a question mark of how much I can trust that earlier statement we've heard from them, because they were like, oh, it kind of also depends if the agency succeeds with changing the RAP rule now in the legislative process with the municipal exemption issue, if it would be indeed a rulemaking around the RAP rule, or if there would be maybe still an effort to do this in a standalone rule just for composting food residuals. So I'm already preparing myself emotionally that we might still have further delays to face with this.
Representative Byrd.
Caroline, is it specifically the pasturing of poultry on compost? That's the rule that it's fairly specific.
Right.
Composting.
Right.
You're looking for a rule on.
Right. It's that, and also just the import of food residuals onto the farm and the composting of that, because farms could also do that without raising poultry, but with different stipulations around that, because they would have to have this principally used framework where they have to land apply most of that. Both of those things.
Representative O'Brien.
Caroline, I remember reading a while ago, I think when this legislation was going through, that the majority of our food scraps go to Maine to anaerobic digesters. Is that still true?
We still today only manage half of the food residuals generated in the state. So there's certainly a bunch of room for growth for in-state management and really realization of that universal recycling law. And also a quick follow-up to you, Representative Byrd, on what else could be covered in that rule. Just one big item that we hope also the ag rule would address is this question about digestates and what is the quality assurance of making sure PFAS contaminants in both like compost or digestates from depackaging technology, that we look at what will be the standard for quality control there and land application as well.
Representative Belson.
You mentioned that in terms of composting that we do about half, and about half that goes off out of state. How do we come up with that number? Because like I compost 100% of my food scraps at my house, but I also this might be the first time I've publicly stated that. So I'm not counting as a Vermont composter.
Right.
So how is that number assessed? Do you know?
I don't know, but that's the information I just got from that Vermont Organics Recycling Summit as one of the presentations. Threw that out there. I could maybe that would be a good question for Natasha Duerte if she indeed comes in. I'm sure she would be able to give you the exact.
Was she affiliated with?
Compost Association of Vermont.
Okay.
So they organized that conference.
Yeah, I know Patricia had reached out to them, and I'm not sure who she spoke to, but I think somebody is. So I think yeah.
Just a couple follow-ups. So I also remember that in your hierarchy, you mentioned that like food scraps to anaerobic digesting is the very lowest, or one of the lowest on the hierarchy. And so who on the policy side is not doing their job as far as saying we aspire to this hierarchy, but we're failing?
Well, I think right now we've at least legislated, it seems like enough to really realize the hierarchy to its full potential. But I think as long as something like Act 41 isn't fully implemented, then the incentive for the market to really diversify farms into this practice is so low that the market will manage the food residuals anyhow, and so it will keep going into the more centralized system of depackaging or larger commercial composting facilities, just because those smaller players don't have the planning security to become an actor. And because of that, then the realization of the vision of that hierarchy will continue to lack, as we don't create those market opportunities that also have something to do with rules and regulations.
Representative Brigham.
Reading that, what you had up now. If you're small, what you mean by small, like we have 100 chickens and 50 meat birds and probably 6 or 7 families bring their food scraps and that's what feeds them. So do we fall into that? Some sort of
Yes,
rule?
you kind of would, because if you have 100 laying hens, you are a farm as defined by the required agricultural practices rule. So you would already be in that tier, and you probably don't import more than 2,000 cubic yards of food residuals a year. So you would be squarely within that framework, and that's exciting to learn about.
We've done it for years, but I mean, I don't know, it's a lot.
You're not on the list.
I was gonna say. Yeah.
Get rid of some chicken.
First time he's ever said that publicly.
Representative Nelson.
Yeah, I like Michelle, my wife and I. 100% compost all our food scraps, not meat. The dog composts the meat, but we compost the rest and, so we wouldn't be counted, and I suspect a lot of people are that way. Last week, we heard from the agency, 11 different places are doing this composting and only 2 didn't have, I don't know. Yes, 2 weren't raising or managing poultry on there. So what are the rules they're following?
The two that don't raise.
No, the 11 farms that are doing composting.
So right now they have to basically follow the A&R rules as an interim. Rule of Vermont has developed a fact sheet to summarize that a little more in plain language that's available on our website. But obviously, those folks can consult with agency staff, kind of on both agencies if they want to, but technically their point person would be the Agency of Agriculture, food residuals, the residuals management section there, and staff there, Dave Huber and Zach Zukowski, to see if they have any questions. There's no requirement in law to register as a farm who does this. So also might be that the list is incomplete because it's not that you have to like report or register as a farm if you're doing this. But certainly that's what I mentioned. Like I feel like that's part of the lack here is that the agency is thinking, well, it's only like 2 handful of people doing this. How relevant is this really? But I can anecdotally share with you when we were doing this campaign for Act 41, just among Rule Vermont membership, we had over 200 farms who said that they would be interested in diversifying into this practice at that time. And so I wouldn't be surprised if there's many other farms just like my farm kind of waiting to see like what's going to be expected of me, while this current scenario where Agency of Agriculture is using A&R rules, that's a situation that's not that user friendly. And there's also a lot of experience that when you call the agency that they like to point the fingers on to someone else internally who is supposed to help you with this or that, instead of taking like a service role where they're going to be like, oh, let me find this out for you. I'm going to reach out to this person and that person and get back to you, that they're going to instead like point the finger to someone else in the agency or even in another agency and send you back on your track to find the answer for yourself.
So the concern might be among people who are contemplating going into this business that the rules that are eventually developed and accepted might be too onerous to go forward, or might be, what can you
Right.
give an
I mean-
illustration of what that might
I mean,
be?
who knows what will be the degree of the regulation, like, let's say, obviously the hot topic would be like, okay, testing of the end product for contaminants. What will be really required there? How costly will that be? What will be the logistics of that? How feasible is that really to do that? And what is the economics of that? How will that impact the outlook of doing this in a viable way? Do I really want to get into that if that's what's going to be required? Likewise, if you build infrastructure, and there's certainly going to be setback requirements for where you can develop these facilities, there's also a limitation by law of not putting those composting facilities into downtown village centers and designated growth areas unless that specific municipality opted in for allowing for those facilities in those areas. So even just for investing in developing your infrastructure, you would want to know, like, am I actually putting it where I'm allowed to put it? Or will I then already, as soon as I'm regulated by the ag rule, have to have a legal battle about needing a variance for where I develop this infrastructure because I'm outside of how this was supposed to be in accordance with the rule? And I could think of many other examples where there's just a series of questions of what will this look like. There is, of course, also in law a requirement that whatever comes out of ag should be equal to or better than this as the standard that's set by the A&R rule. So, of course, to some respect, like the A&R rule shows already like the direction it has to go. Like the ag rule cannot fall short of that. But that, of course, still raises the question, okay, like, will it be more strict? And how much stricter will it be? And some of these things are also evolving, I think, with the testing of food residuals and looking for contaminants. That's still an issue. Like, I don't think we've evolved the science around that so far between 2021 and now that there's like the solution to doing that well at this point. So I'm actually not really too concerned that those requirements will be too strenuous. But in terms of the management requirements, like how solid does your system have to be in place for rejecting contaminated loads and stuff like that, I think anyone would be in greater comfort in setting up a business infrastructure like that and kind of being in the know of what's going to be expected.
Yeah, interesting.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Carolyn, it was, I believe, a week ago, maybe slightly longer, we heard a lot of testimony on farm plastics, whether it was bale wrapping or. And then you were talking about, and that it's a problem, recycling. And it was the market in the Northeast, but the cleaning or desanitizing created more costs. That plus transportation.
Right.
Stop taking, but when you were talking about I believe for the Casella Waste and one of the big players that were importing wrapped composting, and you know, whether it's water quality, potable water, the whole PFAS and microplastics in our food chain or our water system is of serious concern to all human health and soil health. So when you talk about the standards of the rulemaking, it seems to be slowing up the whole process. Does a lot of that have to do with microplastics or PFAS? The biggest concern that the agency has to certify or for the baseline acceptable, or are they more bacterial or other contaminated chemicals.
And I understand the question is basically, are those concerns around that subject part of what's slowing down? Process.
That's my question.
And that would be a good question for the Agency of Agriculture staff. That's not what I heard from them. I heard that the issue with stagnating is more like it's a big undertaking to open up the RAP rules, and there's not just this topic, but a bunch of other topics that would have to be like couched into that effort, and those other topics are not clear yet how they would want to address that in rule. And so it seems what I heard is that it's other subjects that is stagnating this particular ag rule making process. And certainly within the A&R rule making process that's coming up around depackaging facilities, the contaminant issue will be one facet of that rule that is going to be subject to that rule. And then certainly could also be subject of this rule specific to agriculture. And yeah. And of course, it remains a really important concern. We also try to address in our advocacy. We're endorsing H303 that did not move this biennium, that would have tried to ban the land application of sewage sludge more as a policy moving forward in the state. That's still happening in the state on some limited fields, and we were hoping to really phase that out since I think we're at a stage right now where we get the PFAS out of the rainwater everywhere already. So anything more we put directly onto the soil that we know has high loads of PFAS contamination is not going to help us with our food or with a healthy food system. Yeah, definitely interested as an organization to contribute to that discourse and reflecting on where does PFAS enter our food supply chain and how can we mitigate that ubiquitous source of contamination.
Representative O'Brien.
Carolyn, do you know the 13 farms Richard referenced? Did any of them have to get an Act 250 permit? You know?
I know that Vermont Compost had one originally before Act 41 passed, and they continue having one for at least some of their sites. Obviously, they're among those farms that are practicing probably the largest player. So I think they have a special situation. I don't think anyone else who launched this advocacy with us at that time did undergo Act 250 permitting for what they do. And some of them were, though, in administrative challenges of that. But I wouldn't be able to speak on the specifics of that. So we were basically able to circumvent some of those legal conflicts they had through legislation.
It would be interesting for our committee sometime since historically it's been exempt from Act 250, but actually to find out where Act 250 has sort of pushed into like this, or certainly some water rules, wetlands.
One of my neighbors, Joe Acres, has reported estimated 1,800 cubic yards of compost in 2025 is where I get my eggs. And I wonder, I don't know if you get Mark to leave the kingdom to come down here, or Joanne.
So
But there's Dog River Farms on there, Black Dirt Farm. Are you familiar with these?
Yes.
Did they have to go through Act 250? Because they're both, 1,600 cubic yards, and Dog River's 26. That's a small operation, no less important, smaller, but Black Dirt Farm, 1,600 cubic yards of compost. That's fairly robust.
No, I don't think so. And Tom Gilbert of Black Dirt Farm was one of our lead champions in advocacy for this law, because even before Act 41 passed, it was always the law that farming would be exempt from Act 250 permitting requirement. That's where the legal arguments have evolved around like, is this farming? Is this not farming? composting is farming, but food residuals are defined as solid waste, so it got complicated legally in that sense. So I think if I remember correctly, and I didn't prepare in advance for this question, but if I remember correctly, that only Vermont Compost had to undergo Act 250 permitting. Can I pass on this?
They were already there.
Yeah, they were the first and they are probably the largest composter in the state.
Right, they're doing more than the 2,000 cubic
They're
yards.
taking,
All set. Richard?
yeah,
Probably if they're not compost went through Act 250, we must have been putting up some substantial buildings for process rather than just pile up.
Yeah, or if they were in the business before 2021 and didn't have the advantage that now businesses do of being exempt. Well, it would be interesting to get somebody in. These are all members of the association, I think, so perhaps whoever it is that Patricia's able to line up will be one of these farms or more than one. But just to hear about, the business model and hear directly what for them, how it might be advantageous to have the rules. But it does seem like the legislature went to the trouble, and I remember having this conversation back.
Right.
Some of us were if not in the committee, we were part of the legislature's conversation, and so we wanted to, remove a regulatory barrier by saying you can be exempt from Act 250. But also, we recognize that there should be some rules around it. So we tasked the agency with developing the rules, and without the rules, you're in limbo.
I will also add a caveat that for existing practitioners, it's not the greatest concern that they don't have the rule. For them, it's more like, it's great that we don't have more clarity. We can do whatever we did before and no one cares. It's really more for anyone new interested in coming into this. Like, imagine you pull up the required agricultural practices rule on the agency's website today. You see the version from 2018. You don't see even in there that this is a thing. So many new farms that started business since 2018 and now, like, if they haven't followed this advocacy specifically, I mean, they can find information on the agency's website about this, not that they don't have any information on their website that this is a real thing. But if you just look at the rule for farming in the state as it is presented online now, you don't see the updated rule definition of farming in the rule itself. So the rule itself as presented publicly is inaccurate. You would have to go on the legislative website and Google Act 41 of 2020 to see that. And so that's a big shortfall. It's like, yeah.
Don't read anything more into this than what I'm saying, but the Senate version of 323, don't forget, directs, there's language in it that says the legislature is changing the rule. That, here's the rule, we're, through legislative action, changing the rule. So back to your earlier question at the start of the hour again, we can write the rule. Not saying that's a good idea, and again, don't read anything into that, but that is something that the legislature can do.
sarcasm's just gonna blow out of me, but I'd like to rewrite that rule, and can I rewrite a bunch of other rules too? Concerning agriculture and whatnot, but
Let's go.
I will talk to Mark and Joanne just to learn what they had to do, and if they'd be interested in coming in, I think it'd be a hard pull, but we have people closer that are knowledgeable about the thing too, about this too, and the only rules that I can think of quickly in my head is controlling runoff from your compost stack, just like you would for manure stacks and whatnot. You gotta have a way to contain your runoff and, other than that, it's farming. Plain and simple. It's just, continuing having a place for your leachate that comes off from that to go, it gets collected. Last year there'd been none. This spring there'd be some.
And it's certainly part of rural Vermont's concern with S323. If those sections 1 to 3 seek to amend the REP rules, for us, it raises the question, will the agency already get a big chunk of what they're trying to change with the REP rules by doing that, and then don't have to do rulemaking for what they really have an interest in actually doing with the REP rule? And so we would rather like to see a proper rulemaking process with proper public engagement for any changes to the REP that because we also feel like even those changes to the eligibility criteria of what constitutes farming should receive much broader input from the farming community, specifically because of also the concerns of how those changes could impair a beginning farmer to become eligible for programmatic support if they're not considered a farm anymore just because they write off their expenses in their startup phase with the IRS and don't actually have to comply in that business launch period with local water quality standards. So stuff like that. So that's why maybe also use this opportunity to thank the committee really dearly for all your hard work on H941 and getting that to a place that it was passing out of the House. Those two bills do try to achieve the same thing, and we think even though H941, we probably have more work to do on that, can't speak to it in detail yet, but in terms of what it allows for, in terms of local regulation, and we think it does take us off to a much better start for these continued conversations than S323 does, specifically because of all those changes to the REP rules specifically that don't seem to be necessary from our coalition's perspective that we have right now on the municipal exemption, since those changes don't respond directly to the Vermont Supreme Court ruling.
Just this whole conversation made me wonder about, you might know, what happens, say I have a business model and I'm gonna get chicken manure from Maple Meadow and leaves from Rutland City and ground up old round bales that nobody's using. And essentially I was a soil farmer, but not taking solid waste, food scraps from anywhere.
Right.
We've talked about livestock, we've talked about growing food, but say I'm making soil for the people. Is that farming? Where does that fall?
I think composting itself is also part of the definition of farming. We would have to look into the definition in Act 250 and also in the required agricultural practices rule. And I mean, even if I'm not, so that we'd have to look into in the specific case to have an understanding of that, if it would be farming. And then the sale of compost itself, of course, has its own whole set of regulations, depending on what the claim is on the label, it might trigger specific rules and oversight just based on, is that accurate? What is especially with compost, there might be an interest in having specific claims on NPK in there, or how good this is really, and all that is also regulated in its own set of laws.
We did hear about that I think we passed legislation on labeling of compost because, there was the coast of Maine or whatever here, and then there was Scots that for a lot of southern hurricane cleanup, they just grind everything up and call it compost, and nobody knows what's in it, right? So that was what the labeling was trying to.
Mulch is not compost.
Yeah.
All right, any other questions for Caroline? Thank you for
Yeah, thank you.
explaining that. I think that was helpful. And as I said, we'll see if anybody else wants to weigh in, and if committee members have contacts you want to reach out to, feel free to do that too.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Right, we have, so we'll take a little break and then we're expecting testimony. I'm not sure if we're gonna hear from all these witnesses